June 22nd, 1633, Rome. A 69-year-old man is on his knees on a stone floor, dressed in the white penitential shirt of a convicted heretic. His hands are folded. His voice is steady. He is reading, word by word, a document that says everything he has spent his life proving is false is actually false. But here's the strange part. Witnesses in the room later said his eyes weren't broken. They said he looked almost calm. That's the part that should bother you. This is Galileo Galilei, the man who pointed a telescope at Jupiter and found 4 moons that shouldn't have been there if Aristotle was right about the universe. The man who wrote that the Earth moves, that the sun does not circle us, that the entire architecture of the medieval cosmos was a beautiful, comforting mistake. And on this particular afternoon, under direct threat of torture and execution, he took all of that back. Out loud, on paper, signed. For 400 years, this moment has been taught as a betrayal. The great scientist who folded. The genius who chose his life over his truth. But there's a detail that keeps getting left out of the story. Something Galileo did just minutes after standing back up. And once you understand the psychology behind it, the entire scene stops looking like cowardice. It starts looking like something far more human and far more strange than history usually tells you. Let's go back further. By 1633, Galileo wasn't some reckless young rebel. He was old, sick, half-blind from staring at the sun through early telescopes, and he had spent the last 2 decades trying to thread an impossible needle, proving heliocentrism while staying on good terms with the most powerful religious institution in Europe. He had even dedicated his work to friends inside the church. He thought he could win this through evidence. He was wrong. The Inquisition wasn't interested in a debate. They had already condemned Copernican theory as formally heretical back in 1616. Galileo had been warned once, when he published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems in 1632, a book that made the defender of the old Earth-centered universe look, quite literally, like an idiot named Simplicio. He wasn't just publishing science, he was signing a summons. He was brought to Rome, he was interrogated, he was shown the instruments of torture, not necessarily used, but shown, which in the language of the Inquisition was itself a threat with teeth. And on that June afternoon, kneeling in front of the tribunal, he read the recantation they had written for him. He denied the earth moves. He cursed his own conclusions. He asked for mercy. And then, according to a story that's been repeated for centuries, probably invented, almost certainly not literally true, he muttered under his breath, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. Historians mostly agree he never actually said it out loud in that room. It would have been suicidal. But that legend surviving for 4 centuries tells you something important. People have always sensed that something didn't add up about that moment, that the man on his knees and the man who believed weren't fully the same person in that room. And that gap is exactly where the real psychology begins. In 1957, a psychologist named Leon Festinger at Stanford University published a theory that would eventually explain rooms just like this one. He called it cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that happens when a person holds 2 contradictory things at once, a belief and an action that violates that belief. Festinger's original study wasn't about heretics or scientists. It was about a doomsday cult in Chicago that believed the world would end on a specific date. When the date passed and nothing happened, you'd expect the group to fall apart in embarrassment. Instead, they became more convinced than ever. They rationalized. They told themselves the aliens postponed the apocalypse because of their faith. Festinger's insight was this: when belief and reality collide, the mind doesn't always choose reality. Sometimes it edits the story instead, because holding the contradiction fully, consciously, without flinching, is psychologically unbearable. This is exactly what was happening inside Galileo's head in that room, but not in the way you'd expect. He wasn't editing his belief about the Earth. He knew it moved. The evidence hadn't changed. What he was managing was something more specific, a mechanism psychologists now call compartmentalization. The mind's ability to wall off a belief from an action, to let them exist in separate rooms of the psyche so neither one destroys the other. But that's only half the story, because compartmentalizing under mortal threat isn't weakness. Later research on hostages, prisoners of war, and survivors of authoritarian interrogation, particularly work coming out of Cold War-era studies on Chinese thought reform camps, documented by psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton in the late 1950s, found something almost identical. People forced to publicly confess to crimes they didn't commit or renounce beliefs they still privately held often preserved their internal selves completely intact. The false confession sat on the surface. The real self went underground and waited. And here's what almost nobody knows about Galileo specifically. After the trial, under house arrest in his villa outside Florence, blind and aging, he didn't stop working. He wrote 2 new sciences, arguably his most important scientific work, smuggled out of Italy and published in the Netherlands in 1638, 5 years after he knelt on that floor. It has almost nothing to do with astronomy. It's about motion, about the physics of falling bodies, the foundational math that Newton would later build on. The man who recanted spent his final years laying groundwork for the entire field of modern mechanics. Let that sink in. If the recantation had actually rewired his beliefs, that book doesn't exist. This is where it gets strange, because moral injury, a term more recent psychology has borrowed from military psychiatry, developed extensively by Jonathan Shea in his work with Vietnam veterans in the 1990s, isn't caused by what a person does under threat. It's caused by the gap between the act and the values the person still holds. A soldier ordered to do something that violates his conscience doesn't necessarily lose his conscience. He carries a wound shaped exactly like the distance between what he did and what he believed was right. Galileo, kneeling in that room, wasn't experiencing a collapse of belief. He was very likely experiencing that wound in real time, belief fully intact, action forced in direct opposition to it, and somehow surviving that contradiction without it destroying him. Now let's pause here, because this isn't a clean story of quiet heroism either. Some historians push back hard on the romantic version. There's real evidence Galileo was, at points, more accommodating to the church than the rebel myth suggests. He genuinely tried, for years, to reconcile scripture and science rather than defy the institution outright. He wasn't secretly a modern atheist scientist trapped in the 1600s. He was a devout Catholic who believed, sincerely, that truth about nature and truth about God couldn't actually contradict each other. His recantation may have cost him less internal conflict than the dramatic version implies, precisely because he'd already spent years building a mental framework where obedience to the church and belief in his own science weren't fully at war. So that settles it then, right? It was easier than we think? Well, not quite. Because the Eppur si Muove legend didn't appear from nowhere. It appeared because everyone who studied this moment, historians, scientists, ordinary readers for 4 centuries, sensed there had to be a private self surviving somewhere underneath the public performance. The myth might be fabricated, the psychological instinct behind it wasn't. And what if it wasn't fully a choice at all? That's the part modern psychology keeps circling back to. Under extreme threat, the brain doesn't calmly weigh options like a philosopher. The nervous system floods with cortisol, narrows attention, prioritizes survival over consistency. Asking whether Galileo chose to recant, in a room with the instruments of torture displayed in front of him, may be the wrong question entirely. The choice architecture itself was rigged by fear long before he opened his mouth. The same mechanism that let Galileo separate the words in his mouth from the universe in his mind is sitting in your brain right now, waiting for the right pressure to activate it. Every time you've nodded along in a meeting while disagreeing completely. Every time you've said, "I understand," to someone with power over you, while your actual understanding stayed folded up somewhere private, untouched. You weren't lying exactly, you were compartmentalizing, the same way a 69-year-old man on stone floor in 1633 kept the earth turning quietly inside his skull while his mouth said it stood still. He died 9 years later, in January 1642, still under house arrest, still blind, still, according to everyone who visited him, utterly convinced the earth moved. Nobody made him say it out loud again. Nobody needed to.